It started like any other Tuesday, October 14th, 2014. The lunch bell rang at Willow Creek Elementary at 12:05 p.m., just as it had every weekday since the school opened in 1993. Children spilled out onto the playground, laughing, yelling, chasing each other across the rubber track and monkey bars. A light breeze pushed through the early fall leaves. 6-year-old Mason Calder ran straight for the Sandbox. It was his favorite part of recess. His teacher would later say he'd spent nearly every lunch break that month building a sandcastle city. That day, he brought a red plastic shovel from home, tucked into the side pocket of his backpack. It was never found. 2 classmates remembered him kneeling by the edge of the Sandbox. They said he was shaping something with his hands. Both wandered off mid-recess, one to join a tetherball game, the other to grab a juice box from the lunch bin. When they came back 5 minutes later, Mason was gone. Not walking, not running, not wandering, just gone. The sandcastle was half built. His jacket was still lying on the bench nearby. A soft indentation marked where his knees had been. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw Mason Calder. When the recess monitor realized he hadn't returned with his class, she assumed he was in the bathroom. It wasn't until 20 minutes passed, and he wasn't found in the hall, classroom, or nurse's office, that panic set in. By 12:52 p.m., the principal ordered a full lockdown. Teachers barricaded doors. Staff searched classrooms, closets, utility rooms, and the gymnasium. Within an hour, local police were on site. At 2:13 p.m., the Calder family was notified. By 3 p.m., the school was surrounded by squad cars, yellow tape, and news vans. Aerial footage from that day would later show the playground eerily empty, ringed by officers and search dogs. Volunteers lined up along the fence, scanning woods, drainage ditches, and rooftops. The field behind the school was combed twice, then again with cadaver dogs. Helicopters circled overhead until dusk. Search and rescue teams expanded their radius into nearby neighborhoods. All gates were locked, all exits monitored. No one had seen him leave. No cars were reported speeding away. No alarms were triggered. He hadn't wandered into the woods. He hadn't gone home. There were no signs of a struggle, no tire marks in the grass, no footprints leading away from the Sandbox. By evening, the FBI was brought in. They treated the case as a likely abduction, but admitted early on there was no evidence to support that theory. No witnesses, no suspects, no motive. Investigators scoured every inch of the school grounds overnight. Drones were deployed, sewer drains inspected. The Sandbox was dug up entirely, sifted through by hand. Nothing, just layers of clean sand. The only thing left behind was the shape of a small handprint in the dirt and a shallow impression where Mason had been sitting. Interviews began the next morning. Teachers, parents, volunteers, custodial staff. Over 60 people were questioned. Nothing stood out. No one unusual had signed in. The janitor on duty was known, checked, and cleared. A substitute teacher assigned that day was teaching a different class and had been accounted for during recess. No child had seen anyone talking to Mason. No one heard him cry out. No one recalled seeing him stand up and walk away. It was as if, in the span of 4 minutes, a child had disappeared into the air. That week, flyers went up across the county. Mason's face was shown on every news outlet, every digital billboard, every milk carton in the region. Tip lines were opened. Hundreds of calls poured in. A truck stop in Tennessee, a beach in Oregon, a boy matching the description seen in a convenience store camera in Utah. Every lead was investigated. None of them were Mason. For the Calder family, time warped. His room was left untouched. His toys still lined the shelf. His last drawing, an uneven castle with a flag on top, remained taped to the fridge. They held a candlelight vigil by the school fence every month for the first year, then every 6 months. Then, eventually, just on his birthday. His mother once told a reporter, "I don't think he ran. I don't think someone took him in a car. I think he's close. Somewhere we just haven't looked the right way yet." 9 years passed, but investigators would never stop referring to that first day as the most disturbing. Because there was no noise, no chase, no struggle, no trace. Just a half-finished sandcastle, a missing shovel, and a school that never fully recovered. And for nearly a decade, the Sandbox sat untouched, quiet, familiar, and sealed beneath rubber flooring until construction workers pulled it apart. What they found buried there would change everything. In any missing child investigation, the first and most critical step is to establish the timeline. Investigators hoped that school surveillance footage would provide answers. Willow Creek Elementary had 6 security cameras covering its playground, installed just 2 years prior through a state grant. One of them was positioned directly above the sandbox, tilted downward with a clear view of the northeast corner of the recess yard. That was the camera they needed most, and it was the only one that failed. When detectives pulled the footage, what they found was a perfect visual record up until 12:16 p.m., Mason still visible, kneeling by the edge of the sand. At that moment, the feed cut to static. 11 minutes later, at 12:27 p.m., the image returned. But Mason was gone. The sandcastle was unchanged. The entire area looked still and empty, as if time had simply jumped forward without explanation. The glitch had erased the very window they needed to examine. At first, authorities assumed sabotage. They brought in digital forensic experts to examine the DVR system. No signs of hacking, no forced access, no wiped logs. The camera itself hadn't been unplugged. There was no power outage, no surge, no tampering from within the server room. The rest of the school's security feeds were fully intact. The gym, the hallways, the main gate, all fully functional during those same 11 minutes. Only camera 4, playground northeast, cut out, and only during the exact moment Mason disappeared. Technicians reviewed the hardware, wiring, and software logs over the next week. Their conclusion: the error was internal. A recording buffer corruption caused by outdated firmware. A rare, unpredictable glitch, but not impossible. It wasn't planned. It wasn't erased. It just happened. A failure at the worst possible moment. Investigators widened their review to the remaining footage. Camera 3, facing the south gate, showed a handful of parents standing at the fence waiting for pickup. A substitute teacher chatted with a recess aide while watching children play. Everything looked normal, nothing suspicious. From 12 noon to 12:30 p.m., no one is seen entering or leaving. No one ducks behind structures. No cars pull up. No figures linger near the fence line. They slowed the tape down, frame by frame. Nothing. One camera, positioned by the far maintenance shed, did show someone, an older man in navy blue uniform, walking from the rear of the school toward the open field behind the swing set. The timestamp was 12:18 p.m., right in the middle of the window. His pace was steady, not hurried. He didn't look toward the sandbox. He was carrying something in one hand, a trash bag or toolkit. The school identified him as Harold Eames, a janitor employed for nearly 20 years. He'd been on lunch break and was heading to remove a dead bird reported earlier that morning. Investigators interviewed him twice. His alibi checked out. His route made sense. His background was clean. He was cleared within days. But online, his name would surface again and again. As days passed with no new leads, public pressure mounted. Parents formed search parties and community groups. Flyers turned to posters. Posters turned to yard signs. One mother chained herself to the school gate in protest. At a town hall meeting 2 weeks after Mason's disappearance, nearly 100 parents demanded to know how a child could vanish in plain sight on school grounds, and how the one camera that mattered had conveniently failed. The principal stood at the podium and called it a tragedy. The police chief said they were doing everything they could, but no one had answers. Then came the theories. At first, whispers, then blogs, then podcasts. Mason's case drew national attention, not just because he vanished, but because of how cleanly he vanished. No evidence, no trail, no clue. Online forums speculated about child trafficking rings, underground tunnels, and occult kidnappings. One rumor claimed Mason had been seen in a cult compound in Montana. Another said he was part of a custody battle gone wrong. His parents denied this publicly, together, in a press conference. Both passed polygraphs. Both were devastated. A third, darker theory began circulating in whispers, that Mason had never left the school at all, that he was hidden, not taken. Some pointed to a teacher with an expired background check. Others fixated on the idea that someone with access, custodians, aides, volunteers, could have lured him into a closet, a basement, a storage room. The school was searched multiple times with dogs and thermal scanners. Nothing was found. Every inch of the building was cleared. Still, the idea stuck. You don't just disappear, not from a fenced playground, not in 11 minutes. The Calder family avoided the internet, but they heard the theories. And the longer the case dragged on without progress, the more those theories spread. People stopped looking for a stranger and started looking at each other, at the janitor, the teachers, the aides. The silence fed suspicion. And the glitch, the gap in the footage, became the most talked about 11 minutes in local history. For law enforcement, it was a dead zone, a perfect blind spot, a blank stretch of time with no eyes, no audio, and no witness willing or able to fill it in. And without that footage, there was no sequence, no direction, no proof of where Mason went or who might have taken him. But someone had seen something. Someone just hadn't come forward. And it would take nearly a decade and something buried in the very same sandbox to force that silence to break. In the days following Mason Calder's disappearance, detectives shifted their focus to one group of people, those who had access. The assumption was simple. Whoever took Mason would have needed familiarity with the layout, timing, and routines of the school. Stranger abductions in broad daylight were rare. Abductions without any physical evidence were nearly impossible, but someone who belonged, someone who was trusted, that kind of person could move through the school unnoticed. Investigators pulled logs from the front office, sign-in sheets, visitor passes, deliveries, volunteer badges. A list of 48 names was compiled for that Tuesday. Staff were cross-referenced with background checks, no immediate red flags. Still, interviews began. Teachers, recess monitors, front desk staff. Every adult who had been within 100 feet of that playground was questioned. Most were quickly dismissed. One part-time aide had already clocked out before recess. A librarian was out sick. The school nurse had 2 students in her office the entire lunch period, both confirmed. But one name caught the attention of the lead investigator. Samuel Dorsey, 59, a groundskeeper who worked part-time under a third-party maintenance contract, had a record. In 1992, he'd been arrested for trespassing near a daycare center after hours. No children were involved, and charges had been dropped. Still, the report remained. It had never triggered disqualification from employment, as it wasn't listed under the offenses flagged for school vendors at the time. When questioned, Dorsey appeared cooperative. He'd been trimming hedges near the front gate that morning and then had clocked out by noon. He said he hadn't even seen Mason that day. His login time matched his claim. Security footage backed it. His truck left the parking lot at 12:07 p.m., well before Mason vanished. His alibi held. 2 days later, a call came in from a local resident claiming they'd seen a white cargo van parked behind the school around lunchtime. The tip was vague, but enough to trigger a search. Patrol units canvassed the surrounding area and located a vehicle matching the description 3 blocks away. It belonged to a substitute teacher named Greg Hanley. The van was registered under his name and had no visible modifications. Hanley had been assigned to a different campus that day, a middle school 15 minutes away. School logs confirmed his attendance. Surveillance showed him in a classroom at 12:20 p.m. His employer vouched for him. No relation to Mason, no prior complaints. The lead died. For every new suspect, the same thing happened. A few questions, a few hours, and a dead end. Theories were built, then collapsed under the weight of evidence, or lack thereof. Forensic teams returned to the playground multiple times. Soil samples were taken from the sandbox. Specialists scanned for signs of recent disturbance, digging, or foreign objects. If Mason had been pulled underground, into a drain, a duct, a hidden crawl space, they would have found trace evidence. They found none. No broken sand patterns, no loose bricks, no biological matter, not even a smudge. The sandbox itself was removed layer by layer. The plastic liner beneath the sand was intact, uncut, unstained. Ground-penetrating radar showed a solid foundation below. It wasn't an entry point. It wasn't an exit. Just a symbol, a quiet, haunting reminder of the last place he was seen. Amid growing media pressure, investigators made the controversial decision to polygraph Mason's parents, not because they were suspects, but because protocol demanded full clearance of all close contacts. Both volunteered without hesitation. Both passed. Neither had prior CPS reports, criminal records, or suspicious financial activity. Mason's home life, by all accounts, was stable. No custody disputes, no strange relatives, no history of abuse. His disappearance was clean. Too clean. Leads thinned. The hotline grew quiet. The original task force, 32 members strong, began to shrink. Reassignments came. The media cycle moved on. But suspicion didn't vanish. It just turned inward. Parents at the school whispered about volunteers who smiled too much. Staff members watched each other more closely. Children were no longer allowed to roam the playground alone, even in groups. And at the heart of it all, one unresolved question remained. If it wasn't a stranger, and it wasn't someone from outside, then who was it? Over time, the case drifted into a silent gridlock. Dozens of suspects had been examined, none fit. The white van led nowhere. The custodian's record proved irrelevant. The family was clean. And the forensic silence of the sandbox, the perfect square of undisturbed sand, felt more like a warning than a clue. But if no one outside the school did this, and no one inside was ever charged, then either someone had slipped through unnoticed, or someone had hidden the truth long enough that even the best investigators stopped looking in the right direction. That silence would hold for years, until one tiny object buried beneath the surface would finally force the truth to rise. 9 days after Mason Calder disappeared, just as the media was shifting attention elsewhere, a parent called the police with a detail no one had heard before. Her daughter, Olivia, was in Mason's class, 6 years old, quiet, smart. She hadn't spoken much in the days following the disappearance, but while drawing with crayons that morning, she said something that stopped her mother cold. She said she saw a man whispering to Mason near the fence. She said Mason didn't look scared. He looked like he was listening. The police took it seriously. They had to. Child testimony is fragile, often unreliable, but in cases like this, it's also all that's left. Olivia was brought in with her mother and interviewed gently by a child forensic specialist. Her story didn't waver. She remembered it clearly. During recess, sometime after she'd finished her sandwich, she looked toward the sandbox and saw Mason talking to a grown-up. She said the man was crouched down and had a brown shirt like the janitor. She didn't see what happened after. She got called back to line up. The detail stood out. Brown shirt, janitor. But the school's head custodian had been on vacation that entire week. He was out of town, visiting his brother in Phoenix. That had already been verified, which meant someone else had filled in. Investigators pulled the staffing log again, this time looking specifically for last-minute contractors. One name emerged, D. Morrow. No first name, no address, just a sign-in sheet from 7:11 a.m. that day. The initials were scrawled in block letters. His job code was listed under custodial temp, assigned by Pine South Facilities Management, a regional vendor the school district used for substitute janitorial staff. When detectives called Pine South, the conversation turned confusing. They had no record of sending anyone to Willow Creek Elementary that day. No work order, no assignment, no background check on file for anyone named D. Morrow. They insisted all temporary employees were dispatched through verified channels. They checked their logs. No such name, no such person. Investigators pulled the sign-in sheet and reviewed. Security footage again. Camera 6, positioned inside the front office hallway, showed a man in brown work pants and a faded ball cap walking through the lobby just before 7:15 a.m. He signed in, gave a nod to the secretary, and walked toward the maintenance wing. He was carrying a black duffel. No one stopped him. No one questioned him, because people assumed he belonged. They isolated the footage and zoomed in. His face was obscured by the cap and a partial glare on the glass. Not enough to confirm identity. He wasn't wearing a name tag. He didn't speak to anyone directly. When asked later, the receptionist said she remembered him only vaguely. He looked tired, like someone who'd done the job before. That was it. The badge he used was scanned at the security kiosk at 7:12 a.m. It was a temp pass registered to a different name entirely, Eric Madsen. Madsen was a retired HVAC technician who had worked at a different school 3 years earlier. When contacted, he said his badge had gone missing the year prior. He'd never heard of anyone named Morrow. For days, the investigation centered around this ghost identity, D. Morrow. Was it a stolen alias, a fake name, a clerical error? Police checked DMV records, regional employee databases, and previous school maintenance logs. The initials matched no one in the current contractor network, no tax filings, no payroll. It was as if the man had signed in, moved freely through the school, and vanished, before or after Mason did. Some investigators believed the name was intentionally vague. D. Morrow might have been a partial truth, just enough to seem legitimate, just short of being traceable. He had access to the building, he wore the right clothes, he carried tools, and according to a 6-year-old girl, he whispered something to Mason near the fence. But no one else saw him that day. No camera caught him leaving. His duffel was never found. A background investigation was launched into every past Pine South contractor with a D first initial or Morrow surname. Hundreds of names, none fit. The sign-in was the only physical trace. No fingerprints were found on the page. He hadn't touched the pen. He'd brought his own. The media never learned the name. Investigators kept it internal. They didn't want to spook him if he was still local. But internally, the case had changed. For the first time, they had a possible adult male suspect who may have interacted with Mason moments before he vanished, and who had no business being there. Still, without a face, a real name, or a crime scene, there was nothing to arrest. No warrant to issue. Just a memory from a child, a scribbled signature, and a camera glitch that cut out the exact moment it mattered. Over the next months, dozens of people would call in claiming to know a Morrow, all dead ends. The trail grew colder. The name faded from reports. But in one narrow hallway of the Willow Creek Police Precinct, that name stayed on a whiteboard for years, circled in red. D. Morrow. The man who got in without a record and disappeared just like the boy he may have spoken to. 3 years after Mason Calder vanished, the case sat in an unsatisfying stasis. No arrests, no credible sightings. The task force had been disbanded and restructured twice. A few detectives still reviewed it now and then, but most leads had been run into the ground. It wasn't until late 2017 that a cold case analyst, Detective Mara Bell, was assigned to reprocess all original documentation. Her goal wasn't to reopen the case, just to ensure nothing had been missed. But on her third week, while cross-referencing early search maps, she found something odd. A property directly behind the school, the one bordering the northeast fence just 50 feet from the Sandbox, had been marked vacant during the initial sweep. The notation was based on an outdated foreclosure notice pulled from county records. The file assumed the house was unoccupied. As a result, no interior search was ever conducted. Officers had walked the perimeter and noted the windows were dark, the mailbox full. The grass hadn't been cut, no sign of movement, no dogs barking, just another abandoned home in a quiet neighborhood. But by 2017, the property was listed as occupied. Detective Bell checked with utilities. Power and water were active. A phone line had been reinstated in 2016. The new records listed the owner as James Harold, age 62. No criminal history, no property complaints, no calls for service. He paid his taxes on time and kept to himself. Bell flagged it and brought it to her supervisor. Within days, they had a patrol officer knock on the door. The man who answered was polite but quiet. Gray stubble, worn shirt, soft-spoken. He identified himself as Harold James. When asked if he'd been living there in 2014, he said yes, since late 2013. He claimed he had purchased the house through a private sale and didn't know why the system still listed it as vacant. He also said no one had ever questioned him before about the Calder case. He remembered the day Mason went missing. He said he saw the helicopters. He remembered the patrol cars lined up behind his backyard fence. He assumed the police would come knocking, but they never did. Belle was cautious. She ran his name, his deed, his signature. Everything checked out, except one thing. On a discarded envelope in the recycling bin, she noticed something unusual. The name on the return address was H. Morrow. When asked about it, the man's demeanor changed. He paused, then said it was an old name. He explained he used to go by Harold Morrow, but had legally changed his surname years ago to avoid debt collectors. That alone wasn't a crime. But it was enough for Belle to request a warrant. Investigators returned the next morning with a search order for the home and property. The inside was neat but dated. Faded wallpaper, thick drapes, musty carpet. The kitchen smelled of rust and lemon cleaner. The upstairs rooms were mostly empty, save for a recliner and an unplugged TV. A pile of unopened mail sat by the door. In the garage, old tools, rusted shelving, an unregistered riding mower. Nothing that linked to Mason. Then came the attic. Insulated heavily with layers of reflective foil and fiberglass batting, the attic was far warmer than the rest of the house, almost sealed. Inside were several boxes of tax documents, handwritten letters, and stacks of disassembled electronics, mostly radios, old CB units, scanners. Belle noted how the insulation had been doubled up, nailed tightly along the interior beams. Not illegal, just deliberate. They took samples, scanned for trace evidence, and lifted floorboards. No signs of blood, hair, or clothing. No biological material. No photos, no maps, no journals. A dog team was brought through. Nothing. The attic was strange, but not criminal. The electronics were old, the insulation explained as keeping the place warm in winter. The man insisted he had nothing to hide. Still, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. A man named Harold Morrow, living directly behind the school where a boy disappeared, with a last name matching the only real suspect the case ever had, D. Morrow, the fake custodian. But legally, there was no connection, no fingerprint match, no visual confirmation. Harold was 62 years old. The man in the school footage, what little could be seen, looked younger, maybe the 40s. Surveillance timestamps didn't place Harold near the building that morning. The badge used to sign in was linked to a stolen identity, but no one could tie it to him. When asked directly about the name coincidence, Harold just said he didn't know who D. Morrow was. He admitted the overlap was strange, but insisted it had nothing to do with him. He hadn't worked in schools. He hadn't been in the building that day. He said maybe the name was fake. Maybe someone used it on purpose, to throw people off. Belle couldn't prove otherwise. Eventually, the warrant expired. The man remained free. The home was marked cleared, but the detectives who worked that search never really let it go. Because the attic felt wrong. The name felt wrong. And the timing, so precise, so close to where Mason was last seen, was the kind of proximity that haunted investigators for years. There was no evidence, no blood, no body. But there was insulation too thick for comfort, a false name too close to ignore, and a man who'd waited for a knock that never came. Until 3 years too late. In the spring of 2023, Willow Creek Elementary began a long overdue landscaping renovation. The district had approved funding to modernize several outdoor areas, installing safer turf, new equipment, and updated drainage. One of the first targets was the old Sandbox. It hadn't been used in years. After Mason Calder's disappearance, it had become more of a silent marker than a play area. Teachers discouraged kids from lingering near it. Eventually, it was sealed over with rubber safety flooring. By 2020, it was rarely mentioned at all, just part of the landscape. But on May 12th, a 3-man grounds crew arrived to start removal. They peeled back the rubber matting layer by layer. The sand beneath had hardened over time, As one of them began to dig into the compacted surface, the shovel struck something solid. Not a rock, not piping. Something smooth, small. They stopped digging and called the site supervisor, who in turn notified the principal. Within 2 hours, police were back on campus for the first time in years. What they uncovered was a small red toy train, wrapped in a faded piece of cotton cloth, pristine, untarnished. The same model Mason had been carrying the day he vanished. His mother had described it in perfect detail during one of her first interviews. Red plastic engine, 3 black wheels, a chipped sticker on one side. It had been a gift from his older brother. He never went anywhere without it. And now, it had surfaced beneath the very place where he was last seen, buried roughly 10 inches below the old sand. Forensic teams responded immediately. The school was locked down, sealed as an active scene. Parents were notified, staff removed. The Sandbox area was isolated, cordoned off with a temporary structure. Over the next 48 hours, investigators worked around the clock. The toy was tested first. DNA analysis confirmed what many already feared. It carried trace epithelial cells that matched Mason's, but not from the surface. The DNA was recovered from beneath the cloth wrap, consistent with something that had been handled, then sealed carefully, preserved. And the cloth itself contained something else, long blonde hairs, consistent with Mason's childhood profile. The item hadn't been discarded. It had been placed there. That changed everything. The area around the sandbox was excavated in full. Ground-penetrating radar was used to map any unusual cavities or voids below. On the second day of scanning, a technician noticed a narrow hollow pocket stretching diagonally from the northeast corner of the sandbox area, dipping roughly 4 feet down and extending toward the rear of the property line. At first, it was thought to be a utility trench, but the blueprints for the school showed no such feature. Investigators dug manually. At 42 inches down, they uncovered an old maintenance panel, rusted, partially corroded, but hinged. Behind it, a dark, narrow opening no wider than 2 feet. It was not an official part of the building's layout. No one on staff remembered it. None of the janitorial records mentioned it. The passage was barely large enough for a child to fit through. Search and rescue personnel equipped with body cams and thermal imaging crawled into the passage. It extended for 12 feet before branching into a small, hollowed-out crawl space, roughly the size of a large closet. Inside were remnants of foam padding, a half-rotted blanket, and several long-expired food wrappers. Evidence bags were filled quickly. Soil samples were extracted. Hair, fibers, and microbial decay indicators were all collected. It wasn't just an old tunnel. It had been used, and not decades ago, within the last 10 years. The media descended quickly. For the first time since 2014, Mason Calder's name was back in headlines, and this time, it wasn't a cold case memorial. It was a crime scene. Parents were furious. How had this space gone unnoticed? How had it never been found in the original search? It turned out that the tunnel had been part of an early 1960s stormwater project. The system was abandoned during a retrofit in the 80s, but the exterior panels were never fully decommissioned. Later expansions paved over much of the system, but the sandbox had sat above one of the few remaining access points, a literal hole beneath the schoolyard. What disturbed investigators most was the condition of the toy. It hadn't degraded. No water damage, no soil corrosion. It had not been sitting there for 9 years. Based on moisture content and fiber testing, analysts determined the cloth wrap had been buried no earlier than 4 years prior, possibly even later, which meant someone had returned to place it there. Long after the original investigation ended, long after Mason was presumed gone. That revelation flipped the case upside down. This wasn't just a historical recovery. It was recent. It was intentional. Someone had come back, someone still local, still watching, still involved. And if that person had access to the school in recent years, they might have had access to it before. Maybe even in 2014. Maybe even the day Mason disappeared. It was the first true lead in nearly a decade. Not a rumor, not a theory. A physical object buried in silence, deliberately, quietly, methodically. Not to harm, not to hide, but to leave a message or a warning. And whatever lived beneath that sandbox, whatever moved through that narrow tunnel, had done so without being seen. Until now. After the discovery of the hidden tunnel beneath the sandbox, investigators were left with one urgent question. Where did it lead? The initial crawl space was too short to support long-term habitation, yet the food wrappers, padding, and blanket proved someone had used it, even if only temporarily. Structural engineers were brought in to assess the tunnel's age, depth, and connection points. The original construction files for Willow Creek Elementary were retrieved from the county archive. That's when everything changed. Buried in a dusty cardboard box labeled WCE, 1962 Foundation, obsolete, they found an architectural blueprint of the original build. Unlike modern layouts, this early version included a sprawling storm drain system installed beneath the northern wing of the school, a design intended to prevent flooding during the rainy season, but it had never functioned properly. Notes scribbled on the margins revealed that the system had been decommissioned during a renovation in 1987, sealed off from public access, and walled behind the newer boiler expansion. Except, clearly, not all of it had been sealed. When the blueprint was overlaid with the current building layout, a chilling realization emerged. The tunnel beneath the sandbox aligned directly with the location of the old sub-basement, an area that had long since been written out of floor plans. Modern staff believed the basement to be nothing more than a sealed void behind the boiler room. But according to these blueprints, there was a chamber, roughly 10 by 14 feet in size, tucked behind two poured concrete panels, and no one had ever opened it. A demolition crew was called in. On the morning of June 2nd, a team removed a false wall behind the school's storage wing. It took 3 hours to bore through the decades-old seal. Dust poured out. The smell followed. Musty, dry, humans. When the wall finally collapsed inward, what it revealed was not empty space, but a room. A hidden, deliberately modified space, long enough for a mattress, wide enough for a child to stretch their arms. No windows, no light. The walls were covered in insulation, foam padding, and reflective foil. There were no outlets, no HVAC, just layers of silence and survival. Inside, investigators found a thin, stained mattress, expired canned vegetables, several bottles of water turned yellow with time, a worn blanket, size appropriate for a child. Scattered around the edges were broken plastic spoons, a rusted can opener, and the remains of snack wrappers dated 2015 and 2016. Someone had lived here. Recently enough that decay hadn't fully consumed the space. Crime scene technicians swept the room meticulously. Using alternate light sources, they found partial palm prints on the foil. One of them, on the wall behind the mattress, came back as a match for Mason Calder. Hair samples found embedded in the blanket stitching were tested and confirmed as well. The child had been there. At some point in the past 9 years, he had not only entered that crawl space, he had stayed in that room, long enough to eat, to sleep, to leave behind himself. It was a revelation that no one had prepared for. Until that moment, Mason had always been considered a victim of instant disappearance, removed swiftly, never seen again. But now, it was undeniable. He had been hidden, not taken far. Beneath the very school that searched for him, beneath the playground where hundreds of feet ran overhead each day. Hidden in a sealed room built decades earlier and somehow accessed through a forgotten tunnel no one had thought to trace. Theories rushed in. Had someone lured him into the crawl space and kept him there? How long had he lived? Days, weeks, longer? Was he alone the whole time, or was someone down there with him? Fingerprints on the canned goods and wall edges were partial and degraded. Several were unidentifiable. One belonged to Mason. The others? Unknown. There were no lights in the room, yet the foil suggested someone had attempted to reflect or amplify what little light might have come through the access panel. There were no tools found, no recent clothes, no writing, no toys, just bare survival. A fire marshal noted the insulation and sealed design would have prevented most sound from escaping. A child could have screamed. No one would have heard. If he had banged on the wall or kicked the ceiling, it would have echoed silently against the concrete and foam. A prison built from neglect and memory. The school was evacuated indefinitely. Investigators mapped every inch of the hidden foundation. Dogs were reintroduced, soil samples pulled. Structural engineers estimated the room could have supported one person for weeks, maybe more if provisions were passed through. But how they got there, how a child was taken from a sandbox to that crawl space without being seen, still had no answer. But now, the case was no longer cold. It was active, alive. Mason had been there, not in theory, not in speculation, in fact. And if someone had gone to such lengths to build and stock that hidden room, then someone had planned this, thought about it, executed it, quietly, precisely, perhaps more than once. And whatever had ended his time down there, whatever forced that room to fall silent, had never been recorded, never reported, never confessed. But the room had given up its first secrets. The silence had cracked. And investigators were now certain this wasn't an accident, a crime of opportunity, or a vanishing without trace. It was a method, a design. And someone still knew how to get in. After confirming Mason Calder had been inside the hidden basement room, forensic teams returned to examine every inch of the sealed chamber. But what they found next expanded the investigation and the horror into new territory. Beneath the mattress, in a stain that had dried, soaked, and re-dried across the subfloor's foam lining, blood had pooled in an irregular pattern. Forensic analysis confirmed it wasn't Mason's. The DNA profile belonged to an unknown adult male, and this time, it wasn't degraded. The quantity and spread suggested a wound, significant enough to bleed through bedding, but not enough to cause death on the spot. On the opposite wall, faint decomposition patterns were noted behind the foil insulation. One patch of wall bore a distinct chemical stain consistent with early-stage human decay. Blood spatter analysts also noted cast-off patterns higher than a child's reach, indicative of a taller individual. Combined, it became clear someone else had been in that room, someone older, someone bleeding, someone who stayed. The idea shifted everything again. Mason had not been alone in that space. He may not have even been in control of his movements. He may have been watched, kept possibly even raised for a time, by whoever had built that chamber. Investigators returned to old files, old names, and old gaps. D. Morrow had remained the only viable lead all these years. Until now, it was a name with no face, a ghost signature on a sign-in sheet, a brown shirt glimpsed by a 6-year-old. But the discovery of a second person inside the room, an adult male, forced a deeper trace. Cold case detectives reanalyzed the footage from 2014, using new software enhancements unavailable back then. A single frame from a distant loading dock camera, taken 3 weeks before Mason vanished, showed a man entering through the school's rear utility door after hours. He was wearing what appeared to be a custodial uniform. The timestamp, 6:47 p.m. He carried a duffel bag and a key card. The door was not forced. The entrance logs for that day showed no authorized entries after 5 p.m. The key card used did not register in the system. The man entered the building and was not seen exiting. Investigators froze the image and enhanced it digitally. The face remained shadowed, but enough detail emerged to suggest a match. The height, the frame, the shoulder tilt. When compared to old contractor IDs, one name surfaced: David Morrow. He had worked 2 years earlier at a nearby technical school as a contracted night custodian. In 2013, he had been fired after a teacher filed a complaint that he had entered her locked classroom after hours without explanation. No charges were filed. He disappeared from the employment system shortly after. His last known address was a post office box. His tax filing stopped in early 2014. Nobody had traced the name before. David Morrow had slipped through because the school logs only recorded D. Morrow, and David hadn't worked directly for Willow Creek. but investigators now believed he may have used a stolen ID to gain access to the building. And if he had knowledge of the old infrastructure, perhaps from previous maintenance jobs, he could have known about the tunnel, about the basement, about the space no one else remembered. A BOLO was issued. They pulled what threads they could. DMV records were combed line by line, cross-referenced against previous employment logs and even minor traffic citations. Each search produced fragments of a life, but nothing recent. The trail seemed to vanish into silence not long after Mason disappeared. David Morrow, the man at the center of their focus, had once rented a trailer on the outskirts of town, a weather-worn unit tucked behind a row of collapsing sheds. But the utility companies showed no payments on his account for nearly a decade. His driver's license had long since expired. He had no next of kin on record, no emergency contacts, no evidence of medical visits or financial activity. It was as though he had stepped out of his own life and closed the door behind him. The break came, unexpectedly. A parking lot attendant, conducting a routine review of vehicles in an overgrown impound yard, noticed an aging whitework van. It had sat unmoved for years, its paint dulled by sun and weather. The registration tags had expired in 2014. Inside, the air was musty with decay, filled with spiderwebs and the faint metallic tang of rust. Scattered across the floor were corroded tools, crumpled fast food wrappers hardened with grease, and a thick film of dust coating every surface. Then came the discovery that shifted the case. Beneath the driver's seat lay a lanyard, its plastic badge cracked but still legible. It read, Willow Creek Elementary, Temp Access, Eric Madsen. The very same stolen identification that had been used the day Mason vanished. The keys were still in the ignition. The van was processed. Under the floor mat, crime scene techs found skin flakes and hair samples. The DNA matched the adult male blood found in the crawl space. It was him. David Morrow had been in that room. He had bled there. He had left traces no one noticed at the time, and then, it seemed, disappeared from the world. No death certificate, no arrest, no record of a body. He had simply stopped existing in the system, but the evidence told a different story. The mattress, the insulation, the makeshift shelter. It wasn't a one-time crime. It had been prepared, built, stocked. Mason had lived there, and someone had lived there with him. The most likely scenario, the one investigators began to piece together, was that David Morrow had impersonated a contractor to gain access to the school, used his knowledge of its infrastructure to hide beneath it, and had taken Mason during that narrow 11-minute window. He had kept him hidden in a room no one knew existed. For how long, no one could yet say. But there was one final question. Where was Morrow now? Because if he died down there, his body had yet to be found. If he left, no one would have seen him. And if he never left, then something in that crawl space, something beyond what had already been uncovered, was still waiting to be found. When investigators returned to the hidden sub-basement, they brought cadaver dogs with them. The dogs had already shown mild interest in the blanket and mattress, but this time handlers directed them to the floor itself. Within minutes, both dogs alerted near the far corner of the room, pawing and circling a patch where the foam padding had begun to deteriorate. The soil beneath looked slightly different, darker, as though it had been disturbed and then compacted again. A dig team was called in. Carefully, investigators peeled back the foam and dug 6 inches into the compacted dirt. At first, just fragments, splintered pieces of bone. Then, unmistakably, the outline of a rib cage. Hours later, 2 distinct sets of remains were uncovered, one adult, one child. Forensic anthropologists were brought on site immediately. The bones were cataloged, sealed, and transferred to the state lab for confirmation. The adult skeleton was nearly complete. Dental records and DNA matched the profile of David Morrow, the very man who had signed in under a stolen ID in 2014. His cause of death wasn't immediately obvious, no signs of blunt trauma or gunshot wounds, but his femur bore an untreated fracture, healed improperly and then broken again. Experts suggested he may have suffered a fall inside the tunnel or chamber, rendering him immobile. Without medical help, It would have left him reliant on whatever food or water he had stored. When those ran out, he likely succumbed to dehydration or starvation. The child's remains were more fragmented. Only partial skeletal recovery was possible, but among the teeth recovered was a single molar. Dental records confirmed it. It belonged to Mason Calder. The discovery shattered any lingering hope his family might have clung to. Yet it also provided, after 9 years, the first definitive answer to where Mason had gone and what had become of him. Forensic estimates suggested that Mason lived for up to 18 months following his disappearance. Growth indicators in the molar showed development consistent with a child older than the age he vanished. Trace isotopes in the bones suggested intermittent nutrition, enough to survive but not thrive. He had been fed canned food, starches, and water stored in bottles, malnourished but alive. For over a year, Mason had existed beneath the schoolyard in a hidden room no one knew about, with a man whose own life was spiraling into delusion. That delusion was laid bare in the journals found buried under debris in the corner of the chamber. 3 notebooks, water-stained and torn, filled with erratic handwriting. They began calmly, almost structured. David Morrow wrote of his mission to save Mason from what he called the broken world above. He believed society was corrupt, that parents were blind, and that children needed to be reborn underground. He described Mason as special, quiet, obedient, chosen. He wrote of plans to expand the crawl space, to build something larger. He documented meals, sleep, and what he described as lessons he gave Mason each day. But over time, the writing deteriorated. Paragraphs shortened into frantic scribbles, words repeated in loops. "Noise above! They're listening! We can't leave! He must stay with me!" Later entries suggested paranoia had consumed him. He believed people were searching for the chamber. He feared the tunnels would collapse. He claimed Mason sometimes cried for his family, but he insisted they don't deserve him anymore. In the final pages, his tone turned desperate. Food supplies dwindled. His leg injury left him immobile. He wrote of rationing, of forcing Mason to remain quiet in the dark. The last coherent entry read, "The boy is mine to protect. If the world wants him, it will starve with us." Medical examiners concluded Mason likely died before Morrow. Malnutrition, compounded by stress and confinement, would have weakened him. Without sufficient food or clean water, survival past 18 months would have been impossible. Once Mason passed, Morrow, already injured and paranoid, would have been unable to leave or call for help. He remained there, alone with the body of the child he had taken, until he too died in silence, entombed beneath the very playground from which Mason had disappeared. For investigators, the revelation was devastating. It was not a quick abduction, not a crime of opportunity that ended in minutes. It was prolonged captivity hidden beneath the ground while hundreds of people searched above. Parents had stood yards away, police dogs had circled, teachers had walked children to class, all while Mason was alive, only feet below their shoes. The Calder family received the confirmation in private. A sheriff's deputy recalled the silence in the room when the forensic team explained the findings. Mason's mother simply said, "So he was still here." His father wept. There was no comfort in knowing the truth, only the cruel reality that he had been close, within reach, all along. The remains were sealed for further testing, and the journals were entered into evidence. The school district closed the campus indefinitely. Parents pulled their children out. The building, investigators said, would never fully reopen. But there was still one unanswered question lingering above all others. If Morrow and Mason had died underground years ago, then who buried the toy train in the Sandbox only a few years earlier? Who wanted the world to look back at that corner of the playground, and why?